In this short video, I want to talk a little bit about mass media, and I'll be posting this in the sociology YouTube site. Although I'm going to be talking a lot about psychology and the psychological perspective. This is also going to be used for my intro to psych class. So for those people who are subscribed to my sociology website or YouTube site, you'll get a little bit of another perspective. But in deference to that sociology, let's talk a little bit about mass media, because mass media has a really big influence on society and what happens as a society as far as a dissemination of information. And I think we need to actually define what is first mass media. And mass media is those big organizations which disseminate information, traditionally through print, but now even more and more so through electronic means, the internet and websites and radio and television and all the rest of that, to huge numbers or large numbers of people, and large scale communications, and that would be called mass media. And of course, there's a lot of purposes in society, a lot of things that get done through this idea of mass media. First of all, obviously it disseminates a lot of information. Much information. We today know a lot more because of the mass media, but of course all general opinions are formed through this mass media. It provides, theoretically, mass media should provide multiple viewpoints. In the United States, where we do have many different types of mass media, we have different radio stations, some with a conservative and some with a liberal and some with a libertarian, some people who espouse global warming and some people who deny global warming. We can all get this through the mass media. So that is very good. In some societies where the mass media is well controlled or state run, then of course the multiple viewpoints are not necessarily something which people actually can get a hold of. Even certainly in some countries where the internet is well controlled, such as in mainland China or in Turkey or in some other places. And of course, the mass media helps us to learn about new products. In the United States, where it's in other capitalist countries, there's a huge amount of advertising which goes on through the mass media, and that helps us know about new products. We know when the iPhone 5 is coming out, and we look forward to it, and all the different gadgets, but all sorts of other new products that might be coming out. And the last function of mass media is the one which we seem to be most invested in, and that's the ability to entertain us. And I'm going to talk more about this aspect of entertaining when we come to a particular aspect of the mass media and entertainment. I don't have to talk about too much about the fact that it's entertaining, because of course we all are aware of that, and we hope that even when we look at the news it's entertaining. But the problem is that it seems that we're getting, with more and more entertainment, it's also hooked in together with violence. And that fact that we have violence within the entertainment and within the mass media is a big question about how that is actually affecting our society. And there's a lot of debate about that, actually. But in order to address that, I want to look at it from a psychological perspective. In other words, the question is, how does it affect the individual, and from there affect the society? And if we want to talk about how does it affect the individual, we're really asking the question, do people learn violence from watching mass media and the entertainment industry, which is promulgated through the mass media? And of course, traditional psychological learning is through reinforcements and behaviorals and classical and operant conditioning. And in those schools of thought, all of learning was through observable behavior. And they would, according to that philosophy, one wouldn't necessarily learn by just watching something. And this became quite a question in many people's minds. Do people learn just by observing? Or do they need to be taught a particular skill or thought because they've been reinforced, they've been told it's a good thing? And that obviously becomes very important. Do you need to reinforce a violent behavior in order for a child to learn violent behavior, or for an adult to learn violent behavior? Does it have to be rewarded? And that was really probably the most crucial question when we talk about mass media. One might think, well, okay, but how much? Why is this such a big question? Well, because if you take into account the amount of television, for instance, forget about the video games and all the rest of that, just the television that a child sees, let's say between 2 and 4 hours a week, if that's true, then a child before he finishes elementary school will probably have witnessed 8,000 murders and 100,000 other acts of violence just from television alone. And you can say that, okay, but really the point is that violence doesn't help, but does it? Does it make a difference just watching? And are they actually understanding what does go on? So we do know that people can learn just by observing. There's a lot of observational learning going on. We observe by watching our mothers cook in the kitchen. We can learn to cook, or other things. We watch. Children will listen to their parents speak their native tongue. When they speak their native tongue, only to hide the message from the children. But children learn it. They pick it up. They might not be able to talk it, but they certainly learn it. And so the first question was, do organisms actually learn just by absorbing or observing? A classical experiment was that when they took some rats and they let rats walk around in a maze without teaching them anything, and then they measured how long it would take them to learn the maze to get food. In other words, to get a reward, to get reinforced. And when they compared that group to the group of rats who learned only by getting the reinforcement, okay? In other words, 10 days of just wandering around the maze, and then giving them a situation where they would have to learn the maze for food, as against another group which were not given an opportunity to stroll around in the maze, and then give them the opportunity to learn with the reinforcement of food. It turns out that those that get an opportunity to learn by walking around, or by walking around, they actually learned faster how to get the food. That's indicative that there must be something going on in the brain, some sort of connection, which is cognitive, not only behavioral. And so there started to build in the early years of the 20th century, or actually the middle years of the 20th century, a amount of data which indicated that people actually learn by, or organisms and people learn just by something, connection going on in their brain, not necessarily by reinforcement. So a fellow named Albert Bandura was really, really into learning, studying this. And for my class in psychology, I will put a link up to for a YouTube video featuring Albert Bandura and this particular study, which I will talk about. And this is a classic study where he wanted to know if children who watched acts of violence would play more violently subsequently to their observing. And he showed children a model who was beating and hitting a inflated balloon doll, a Bobo doll. And when he did that, he found that children would not only copy that model, right? This person was considered the person who was observed was called a model, and would copy that role model, but also would enhance it and find new and more ingenious ways of acting violently towards the Bobo doll. even though they actually had other opportunities and other possibilities for for playing, which in a nonviolent fashion. So this would happen. So this showed that there was actually an opportunity to learn through modeling, and I suggest that if those of you who are not in my class and are looking at this, YouTube Albert Bandura and Observational Learning. So the question, so you see that this actually is something that can happen. So if that's true, then what about the television situation? How does that affect it? Well, it turns out that there's been numerous studies throughout the years. This is going back to the early 70s, and now we're talking about another 30, 40 years later. And there's been numerous studies linking observing violence in television, on video games, and the amount of violence that is displayed by youngsters after watching that. And there are four, or actually five, different mechanisms which occur through watching the violence in the media, in the mass media in particular. First of all, that idea of observational learning, that just by the mere fact of looking at the violence allows the observer to pick up some of those skills vicariously. We know that now because they actually have that going on in a subtle form in their muscles through the picturing it of in the brain. A second mechanism is we call disinhibition, which means they're less likely to get scared from watching it. It's something which becomes they're not inhibited, right? Their inhibitions to violence become weaker. A third mechanism is increased arousal. In other words, watching violence it gives you a rush, a high, not maybe a big one, maybe a big one, but because there's no harm, no physical harm to it, and you get disinhibited, then it actually has some sort of interior and reinforcing effect, because there is arousal effect. You get a rush from it. And a fourth mechanism is what we call priming of aggressive thoughts and behavior. Because as we looked, in some other place, we talked about how conditioned responses can be primed. When you start to do something in a conditioned response, you automatically learn the next steps. This will happen also with violence. And the fifth mechanism is habituation. You get used to it. It becomes part of your life. It becomes something which becomes the norm. So we see that there's many different types of possibilities through the observational learning that it will affect the individual, and obviously from the amount of many individuals, when we talk about mass media, it can affect entire society.